The sun was a cruel overseer on the wide, barren plains, glaring down on the cracked earth where once green pastures had spread. John wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve, his shirt clinging to his lean frame. His land, inherited from his father, had given him nothing but dust for 2 long years. The drought had claimed nearly everything he owned, his herd reduced to a single old horse that limped more than it walked, and a barn that sagged like an old man's shoulders. Hunger gnawed at his belly each night, and though he worked from dawn till dusk, there was never enough to show for it. He had gone from a proud young rancher to a man scrapping for survival, his boots worn thin and his pockets nearly empty. Word spread fast in small towns, carried like wildfire by gossiping tongues. At the general store, John overheard the whispers. A wealthy farmer's daughter, Martha, was still unmarried, though past the age most women found husbands. She was described as heavy-set, plain, with a quiet nature that kept suitors away. Men chuckled cruelly when they spoke of her, shaking their heads as if she were more a burden than a bride. But what silenced the laughter, what caught John's ear, was the rumor of her father's offer to the man who took her hand in marriage. He promised the cow a healthy, strong, and already proven to give good milk for most. The thought was laughable, a marriage for livestock. To them, it was scandalous, absurd, even shameful. But for John, it was temptation itself. A cow meant milk, butter, maybe calves, and calves meant money. One cow could be the start of rebuilding everything he had lost. Still, pride was a hard thing to swallow. He lay awake nights in his small cabin, staring at the empty rafters, his stomach twisting not only with hunger but with the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of his father, who had taught him that a man's word and his pride were worth more than gold. But what good was pride when your ribs showed through your shirt? On the morning he finally made his choice, John saddled his tired horse and rode into town. He found the farmer in his wide porch chair, chewing on a stem of hay, his daughter sitting inside, barely visible through the window curtains. The old man sized John up, his sharp eyes reading the hunger, the desperation, the silent plea carved into his face. He wasted no time in speaking. "You'll take her as your wife, and you'll take the cow. But once you say the words, there ain't no turning back." John's throat was dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. He nodded slowly, sealing his fate. By sundown, the town's little chapel was filled with murmurs and curious faces. The dusty pews creaked under the weight of neighbors who had come not for celebration but for spectacle. A poor rancher, gaunt and sunburned, stood nervously at the altar, while beside him Martha appeared, her cheeks pink, her hands trembling as she clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers. The preacher's words blurred in John's ears, drowned by the murmurs of the crowd. To him, each whispered chuckle felt like a nail hammered into his pride. He glanced at his bride, seeing not the woman but the cow waiting outside, tethered and chewing quietly as if mocking him. When the vows were spoken, John forced the words past his lips, his voice rough but steady. Martha's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and hope, though he barely noticed. Outside, children ran to see the cow, pointing and laughing as though it were part of the ceremony itself. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and the crowd shuffled out, leaving behind a silence that pressed down heavier than the day's heat. John took Martha's hand, her palm soft and damp against his calloused fingers. He led her out into the evening light, where the sky glowed red with the dying sun. The cow stood waiting, its flanks gleaming, its eyes steady and calm. The townsfolk lingered nearby, watching with sly smiles and sideways glances. To them, this marriage was a joke. To John, it was survival. His jaw clenched as he held his head high, pretending not to hear the laughter that followed them down the dusty road. Inside, though, shame and desperation warred in his chest, and the weight of what he had just done pressed harder with each step. Thought the wedding meal was simple, far from the feasts John remembered from younger days when his family had been better off. A few loaves of bread, a pot of beans, some dried meat, and a jug of cider were spread across a rough wooden table. Neighbors came mostly out of curiosity, more eager to gossip than to celebrate. They clapped John on the back with smirks and muttered comments he pretended not to hear. "Lucky man, he's got himself a cow now," one said loud enough for half the room to catch. Another laughed, Hope she gives milk as well as the cow does." The words burned, but John forced a grin, swallowing his pride with each bitter mouthful. He had learned to endure ridicule as he had endured drought silently, with his jaw set. Martha sat quietly at the other end of the table, her shoulders hunched as though she wanted to disappear into herself. She nibbled at the bread, eyes downcast, cheeks still flushed from the ceremony. She knew what they whispered, what they thought of her. It was not the first time she had heard laughter at her expense, but tonight the sting cut deeper because it was tied to her marriage, to the man beside her who barely looked her way. She had hoped for a partner, a chance to build something tender in the solitude of ranch life. Instead, she felt like a transaction, as though she herself were nothing more than the rope tied around the cow's neck. The hours passed slowly. Children ran about the yard, men smoked and drank, and women whispered with their heads bent together, casting sidelong glances at the bride. The cow, tethered near the barn, chewed lazily, its presence almost louder than the guests' chatter. John caught himself staring at it, measuring in his mind how much milk it might give, how many calves it could bear, how much money could be saved or earned from its strength. His heart should have been on the woman beside him, but hunger and survival left little room for romance. As dusk settled, the guests departed one by one, their laughter fading down the road. The small house felt heavier in the silence they left behind. John lingered by the door, staring out at the yard as though the night sky held answers. Martha busied herself with clearing the table, her movements deliberate and quiet. Neither spoke. When the last dish was set aside, John finally turned toward her, his mouth opening to form words, though none came. What could he say? That he had married her for a cow? That he had traded his name and his pride for survival? That was the truth, and the truth was a cruel blade he dared not put into her hands. Martha's heart beat fast, her palms damp as she folded the last cloth and placed it neatly on the shelf. She could feel his eyes on her, but she did not dare meet them. She wanted tenderness, some small gesture that would tell her she mattered beyond her father's bargain. But John only stood there, hands clasped behind his back, silent, torn between duty and discomfort. The gulf between them widened with each passing second. Finally, she rose without a word and walked toward the small bedroom. John's eyes followed her, uncertain, hesitant, half expecting her to pause and glance back. Instead, she stepped inside, closed the door, and slid a bolt into place with a sharp, final click. The sound echoed through the house like a hammer strike. John stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the locked door, his chest tightening with something he could not name. Pride, anger, shame, all tangled together. He looked around the empty room, the firelight flickering against the walls, casting shadows that danced like mocking figures.